At 6:42 in the morning on May 20th, 1941, Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume stood inside the Field Punishment Center at Platanius on Crete, watching German Volksarmee paratroopers drift down through the early light like a dark cloud spreading across the sky above Mailly Airfield. He was 30 years old, had spent 8 months as a provost sergeant, and had never fired a shot in real combat. Now the largest airborne assault in history was crashing down around him as more than 3,000 German paratroopers dropped in the first wave, with more preparing to follow. He supervised 23 New Zealand soldiers who had been sent to the punishment center for drunken fights for theft for indiscipline. The army called them troublemakers. Hume saw them as ordinary men who had made mistakes. And in this moment, every man who could hold a rifle was needed. The paratroopers landed everywhere in the olive fields, on narrow roads, and across the open spaces surrounding the airstrip. Some were caught in their parachutes and died before touching the ground. Others landed cleanly and formed fast-moving groups of trained infantry. The 23rd Battalion had arrived on Crete less than 1 month earlier. Most had never seen real battle. Now they were face to face with a full-scale German airborne invasion. Hume sprinted to the armory, grabbed as many rifles as he could carry, and handed them out to the prisoners without paperwork, without authorization, and without questions. The men took the weapons silently and followed him toward the growing roar of gunfire. By midday, he had already led these improvised fighters in 3 sharp engagements around the airfield. German fire was relentless. Machine guns tore through the olive trees while mortars crashed around their positions, and snipers fired constantly from unseen heights. Still, Hume pushed forward, clearing groups of German paratroopers who had gained ground in front of the New Zealand line. By the end of the first day, 130 German bodies lay scattered across the fields and stone terraces. The sniper threat revealed itself quickly. German Volksarmee marksmen carried precision, scoped carabiner rifles and wore camouflage smocks that blended almost perfectly into the Mediterranean countryside. These snipers crept into New Zealand sectors, settled into high ground and shot officers, radio men, and anyone who looked like leadership. Standard training offered no real answer. You could not fire back at what you could not see. By the time a muzzle flash appeared, someone was already dead. On May 21st, Hume was moving between forward positions when a sharp crack split the air. A corporal dropped 10 feet to his left. A second shot followed, and a private fell. Hume threw himself behind an olive tree and scanned the ridgeline, but nothing moved. The enemy shooter was invisible. Later that afternoon, Hume stepped forward and volunteered to hunt the snipers alone. Lieutenant Colonel Leckie approved his request. During the next 2 days, Hume used traditional counter-sniper methods, patience, careful movement, and long periods of stillness to track and kill several German snipers. But each kill was matched by more arrivals. For every marksman, he eliminated 2 more appeared across the hills. On May 22nd, while walking past the punishment center compound, Hume encountered a single German paratrooper who had lost contact with his unit. The man looked barely 19. He looked frightened but lifted his rifle when he spotted Hume. Hume was faster. 1 shot to the chest dropped the young soldier instantly. Hume approached the body and noticed the distinctive splinter-patterned camouflage smock worn by elite Volksarmee units. Beside the body lay a scoped carabiner rifle in fine working shape. He checked the action and found 7 rounds still loaded and 2 full magazines in the soldier's equipment, bringing the total to 47. Hume stared at the smock and rifle. He thought about the New Zealanders dying to snipers hidden in the hills. He thought about the Germans moving freely because they looked identical from a distance. He thought about how many of his men he might save if he could walk among the snipers unseen. He stripped the camouflage smock from the dead paratrooper and pulled it over his New Zealand uniform. It was still warm. Blood stained one side, but the rest was intact. He slung the German rifle across his shoulder. He did not request permission. He did not inform anyone. He simply turned toward the German lines dressed as one of them, armed with their weapon, and determined to get close enough to strike first. At 7 in the morning on May 23rd, he moved through the olive groves west of Maylene wearing the German smock. The splinter pattern broke his outline perfectly. From 200 yards, he looked like any other German soldier shifting between scattered positions. At 7:45, he spotted his first target. A German sniper was settled inside the broken walls of an old farmhouse overlooking the coastal road. It was an ideal vantage point. The sniper scanned slowly and steadily. Hume approached from the east, walking openly as though returning to his post. The sniper glanced at him, noted the uniform and rifle, and went back to watching the road. Hume closed to 50 yards, then 40, then 30. At 25 yards, he lifted the rifle and fired once. The sniper collapsed without a sound. Hume searched him, found a map marked with New Zealand positions, and took the ammunition. Before midday, he had used the same method to kill 3 more snipers. Walk openly, get close, shoot once. German soldiers saw only another man in their own uniform. The change was felt instantly across the New Zealand lines. Sniper casualties dropped. Officers could stand and observe. Radio men survived long enough to finish messages. No one knew how Hume was doing it, but everyone saw the results, and Hume was only getting started. The German sniper Hume had just killed at the ruined farmhouse lay sprawled across broken stones, yet the real weight of the moment did not hit Hume. What mattered was that the deception worked, and if it worked once it would work again. So he slipped away through the olive groves, moving as calmly as any Fallskärmjäger, shifting between positions. All around him, the distant crack of rifles echoed across the hills as scattered German marksmen continued to hunt New Zealand officers along the withdrawal routes. At mid-morning, Hume spotted another sniper hidden inside a clump of brush overlooking a bend in the coastal road. The sniper was settled low, studying the terrain with steady discipline. Hume approached the area with the same open stride, appearing casual, like a paratrooper checking adjacent sectors. The sniper glanced at him briefly and then returned to scanning his fields of fire. Hume closed the distance to 40 yards, then 30, then 20. When he raised the rifle, the German did not even flinch until the round struck him cleanly and dropped him where he sat. Hume took the man's ammunition and moved deeper into the hills. By noon on May 23rd, he had eliminated 4 German snipers, all using the same method, and none had realized he was the enemy until the final second. Across the New Zealand positions, the effect was immediate. Patrols began moving through contested areas again. Officers lifted their heads without fear of sudden death. Radio operators could work without being hunted. No one understood exactly how the impossible had happened. They simply felt the crushing pressure of sniper fire begin to lighten. But Hume knew the enemy would not stop, so he refused to stop. On May 24th, he pushed his operation further than before, moving behind German lines where no normal counter-sniper patrol could go. The scattered nature of the airborne assault worked in his favor. German units were fragmented. Groups of paratroopers wandered between improvised posts trying to rejoin their formations. Communications were broken. Orders were unclear. Confusion spread across the hills like smoke. In that environment, one more man in a German smock moving through the landscape drew no attention at all. Hume passed within 10 feet of German soldiers who barely glanced at him. He walked through assembly areas where men repaired equipment without asking who he was. He crossed narrow paths where nervous paratroopers whispered about Allied counterattacks without suspecting the man passing beside them. Late in the afternoon, near the village of Galatas, a German officer, a Fallskärmjäger Oberleutnant, approached him and gave sharp instructions in German while pointing toward the ridgeline. Hume nodded and walked exactly where the officer directed. The officer turned away without a second thought. He never realized he had just handed tactical details to the man responsible for crippling his sniper teams. By sunset of May 24th, Hume had killed 11 German snipers in 3 days. Yet he still refused rest even when Lieutenant Colonel Leckie insisted he stand down. Hume simply said the snipers were still killing New Zealand soldiers and returned to the hills before dawn the next morning. On May 25th, the division launched a counterattack to retake Galotas. The Germans had turned a schoolhouse at the western edge of the town into a fortress. Machine gun fire poured out of the windows, pinning the New Zealand platoons in the debris-filled streets. The attack faltered. Hume joined the assault and crawled forward under fire until he reached the building itself. He yanked 3 stick grenades from his belt and hurled them through the ground floor windows. The explosions silenced the gun crew, and the New Zealanders surged forward, retaking the town in savage close-quarters fighting. Their hard-won victory lasted less than 1 day. German reinforcements counterattacked through the night, and by May 26th, the New Zealanders were pushed back and forced to withdraw toward Suda Bay. Crete itself was slipping away. That night, a runner found Hume among the withdrawing units and handed him a message scribbled on rough paper. Hume read it twice in the dark. His younger brother, Corporal Harold Charles Hume, had been killed in action on May 26th while fighting with the 19th Battalion northeast of Galotas. Hume folded the message, slid it into his pocket, and lifted the German rifle again. His face remained steady, but inside something shifted. The retreat could wait. The German snipers following the New Zealand withdrawal were about to face a man who no longer fought only for survival or duty. At 5 in the morning on May 27th, Hume positioned himself on a hillside overlooking the road leading to Suda Bay. Below him, the 23rd Battalion moved in a fighting withdrawal, while German forces advanced aggressively behind them. German snipers moved with the pursuit hunting officers to shatter the chain of command. Hume scanned the ridgelines and counted at least 8 of them spreading out across the high ground. He had not slept since receiving the message about his brother. Instead, he had spent the night studying the terrain, memorizing sniper routes and mapping kill zones in his mind. His first target appeared at 5:20. A German marksman climbing a rocky outcrop south of the road with the confident, methodical movements of a veteran. Hume tracked him through the Zeiss scope, waited until the man settled into his hide, and shot him cleanly through the chest. As soon as the man fell, Hume shifted position. He never fired twice from the same place. By 6:15, he killed a second sniper. At 7:30, he eliminated a third from hundreds of yards away. By 9, he had removed 5 enemy marksmen from the ridgelines, protecting the withdrawal. Behind him, the New Zealand rearguard suddenly moved faster with better cohesion and far fewer casualties. No one down below knew he was there. They simply realized the deadly sniper fire had almost vanished. At 10:40, Hume spotted 5 German snipers establishing a perfect ambush position on a hill overlooking the exposed flank of the withdrawal. If allowed to settle, they would cut the battalion to pieces. Hume walked toward them openly in the stolen smock. One of them waved, another called out casually. Hume waved back. At 40 yards, he raised his rifle and shot the nearest man. The others froze in confusion. He worked the bolt and shot the second. 2 more reached for rifles. Hume dropped both. The 5th fired one wild shot that flew past Hume's head before Hume's next shot ended the fight. He searched the bodies, found maps, ammunition, and orders detailing their mission to destroy the New Zealand withdrawal. He pocketed everything and continued the hunt, knowing that every sniper he removed saved dozens of New Zealand lives still struggling through the retreat. Hume had now become a silent force moving ahead of the retreating battalion, and every step he took was fueled by the news of his brother's death. He spent the night slipping through German positions, learning how their snipers moved, how they chose positions, and how they coordinated their attacks. By dawn on May 27th, he knew the shape of the battlefield so well that he could predict every ridgeline that the German snipers would try to occupy. At 5:20 that morning, he eliminated the first sniper of the day, and by shifting constantly through rocky gullies and patches of thick brush, he prevented the Germans from guessing his location. By 6:15, he had killed a second marksman from a completely different angle, and by 7:30, a third man fell shot through the chest before he could settle his rifle into firing position. The withdrawal route was 2 miles long and lined with high ground on both sides, and the Germans intended to use every inch of it to cut down the retreating New Zealanders. Hume understood that if he failed even once, dozens of men would be slaughtered in the confined terrain. At 9 in the morning, he had already taken out 5 snipers in a span of 4 hours, and the rear guard felt the difference instantly as fewer shots cracked across the valley. Officers began directing movement instead of hiding behind rocks. Runners sprinted between platoons with messages. The entire flow of the retreat gained new life, though none of them yet knew who was protecting them from the high ground. As the battalion moved westward, German forces pressed harder. At 10:40, Hume spotted a cluster of 5 German snipers settling into a perfect killing zone overlooking the battalion's left flank. If they opened fire, the retreat would collapse. Hume walked steadily toward them, wearing the German smock and carrying the German rifle. The men waved at him, believing he was one of their own. At 40 yards, Hume shot the first. A second later, he worked the bolt and dropped the next. Panic spread among the remaining snipers as they reached for rifles. Hume fired twice more, dropping 2 instantly. The 5th managed to fire a single round that snapped past Hume's head before Hume put him down. When he searched the bodies, he found detailed orders showing that these snipers had been assigned specifically to target the 23rd Battalion during the withdrawal. He gathered the ammunition and documents and continued hunting. By mid-afternoon of May 27th, his confirmed kill count stood at 16 snipers in 2.5 days. During a brief halt, Lieutenant Colonel Leckie found him and asked if he could continue operating alone. German snipers were tearing into the retreating units, and every kill Hume made kept men alive. Hume simply nodded. He said nothing about his brother's death, and nothing about the weight gathering in his chest. Leckie gave him written authority to act independently for as long as needed. Hume re-entered the hills at 16:30. Ahead lay a narrow valley dominated by steep ridges that offered perfect positions for enemy snipers. He scouted the area and found 3 German marksmen already in place, ready to unleash devastating crossfire once the battalion entered the valley. He killed all 3 before they fired a single round. When the battalion passed through, not one man fell to sniper fire. Night came, but the withdrawal was far from over. The next day, May 28th, the battalion would need to reach Stios, a point of critical terrain where the Germans would almost certainly wait with every weapon they could muster. At 4:30 in the morning, the battalion began its movement away from the fading defensive lines near Galotas. The open ground towards Stios exposed them to every hilltop and ridge. Hume moved far ahead into the shadows of the ridgeline. At 5:15 he reached the top and immediately saw the danger ahead. A German heavy mortar crew was setting up a Granatwerfer mortar on the crest of the hill. 4 men worked with practiced efficiency, aiming the tube directly at the exact stretch of road the rear guard had to use. If they were allowed to fire, the battalion would be destroyed before reaching Stios. They were 800 yards away, too far for a clean rifle shot. Hume knew that if he reported the position, it would be too late. The mortar would be dropping shells on his battalion before any help arrived, so he moved closer, slipping between rocks and dry gullies until he reached the last 300 yards of open ground. There was no cover, no concealment, only the stolen German uniform. He adjusted the camouflage smock, stood up, and walked directly toward the mortar team as though he belonged there. The Germans saw him immediately. One waved. Another shouted a question. Hume waved back and kept walking. At 50 yards he could hear their voices. At 30 he heard one man laugh. At 15 he raised his rifle and shot the nearest German. He worked the bolt and shot the second. The remaining 2 lunged for their weapons, but Hume shot them both before they could react. He then disabled the mortar by pulling out the firing pin and throwing it down the slope. Ammunition crates followed and tumbled out of reach. With the mortar neutralized, Hume scanned the ridgeline with field glasses and saw 3 more German snipers setting up firing positions to ambush the New Zealand withdrawal from multiple angles. He approached the first 2 using the same deception and killed them both before they realized he was not a Fallschirmjäger. The 3rd sniper, however, sensed something wrong. At 80 yards, he turned and stared at Hume. His eyes moved from the smock to Hume's face and then to the rifle. He lifted his weapon. Hume shot first, but the sniper managed to fire a single round as he fell. The bullet tore through Hume's left shoulder, spinning him sideways. He dropped to one knee, feeling bone grind beneath torn muscle. He fired again to ensure the German did not rise. Blood soaked through the smock, and his left arm hung useless at his side. Still more German snipers moved through the hills. Hume wrapped his shoulder with a torn cloth taken from the dead sniper and continued. At 8:30, he spotted another marksman preparing to fire on the retreating rear guard. Hume lifted the rifle with one hand, bracing it against a stone. His vision blurred. The shot missed. The German turned and returned fire, hitting Hume again in the same shattered shoulder. He fell behind the rocks. The German began closing in to finish him. Hume lay bleeding on the ridge alone and fading, but determined that this final German would not be the one to end his story. Blood was pouring from Hume's shoulder, and his vision pulsed with every heartbeat as he lay behind the rocks, listening to the German sniper closing in. The footsteps grew louder, crunching across loose stones, as the German advanced carefully with rifle raised, knowing that a wounded enemy could still be deadly. Hume's left arm felt like dead weight, and every breath seared through the shattered bone. He forced himself to stay awake, gripping a palm-sized rock with his right hand and waiting for the perfect second. The sniper stepped closer 10 feet away, then paused as though listening for movement. Hume hurled a stone far to his left, and it clattered loudly against the hillside. The German reacted instantly, turning toward the sound and firing twice. In that narrow window, when the barrel was off target, Hume rolled to the right, grabbed another rock, and hurled it straight at the German's face. The stone struck hard, staggering the sniper backward and knocking his rifle slightly offline. Hume pushed himself forward, driving the weight of his body into the sniper's legs, and the two men crashed together on the rocky ground. The German struggled to bring his rifle around, but Hume seized the barrel with his right hand and wrenched it aside. The sniper reached for a knife on his belt. Hume slammed his forehead into the man's face, felt bone crack, and struck again until the knife dropped and the German went limp. Hume remained lying on top of the unconscious sniper, breathing heavily, fighting to stay conscious as fresh blood leaked through the torn camouflage smock. His left shoulder felt like it had been crushed under a hammer. His body was failing, and he knew that if he stayed still too long, he would simply bleed out on the ridge. Below him, the withdrawal route was empty. The 23rd Battalion had already passed through, heading towards Stios for the next defensive stand. He dragged himself off the German body and began crawling downhill, using his right arm to pull himself forward while his left arm hung useless at his side. Loose stones tore his palms and elbows. Dust filled his mouth. Several times the world tilted and blackened around the edges, but he forced himself onward. At 9:40, a New Zealand patrol spotted him collapsed beside the road 2 miles from Stios. The patrol commander knelt beside him, saw the ruined shoulder, and shouted for stretcher bearers. Hume tried to warn them about remaining snipers, but the words tangled in his throat. They carried him quickly to the battalion aid station at Stios, where the medical officer examined the wounds and immediately marked him for evacuation. Both bullets had shattered the scapula. Jagged bone fragments were embedded deep in torn muscle. Without surgery, he would die from infection or blood loss. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Leckie visited him, bringing field reports from the withdrawal. Sniper fire had almost completely disappeared. The rear guard had suffered minimal casualties. The mortar crew Hume destroyed would have killed dozens. Leckie told him he was being recommended for the Victoria Cross. Hume asked only about his brother's body, whether it had been recovered, whether there would be a grave. Leckie had no answer. Many dead had been left behind during the retreat. On May 29th, the battalion reached the evacuation point at Esfakia on the southern coast, where Royal Navy destroyers waited to rescue the surviving Allied troops under constant air attack. Hume was loaded onto one of the ships along with hundreds of wounded men. The destroyer departed Crete at 2300 hours on May 30th. German aircraft attacked the convoy twice during the journey. Anti-aircraft guns thundered against the night, and 3 Stuka dive bombers were shot down. Hume watched from the medical bay, unable to lift his head without feeling a stab of pain. After 18 hours at sea, the convoy reached Alexandria on June 1st. Hume was taken directly to a military hospital, where surgeons spent 4 hours removing bone fragments, repairing muscle, and sewing torn tissue. They told him he would never regain full strength in his left arm, and that he was unfit for combat service. His war was over. On June 15th, he boarded a hospital ship bound for New Zealand. The journey lasted 3 weeks. He spent most days staring at the ceiling, thinking of his brother, thinking of the snipers he had killed, thinking of the men whose lives had been saved because those German rifles had never fired their last shots. He reached Auckland on July 10, 1941 at 7 in the morning. His wife Rona waited on the pier, unaware of how badly he had been wounded. When she saw him walking down the gangway, thin, pale, and with his arm bound in a sling, she burst into tears. Hume spent the next 6 weeks recovering at a rehabilitation facility at Rotorua, undergoing physical therapy and medical reviews. The army wanted to discharge him as medically unfit. Hume did not argue. His shoulder could barely lift his arm above his chest, and he could not fire a rifle. On August 20th, a telegram arrived from headquarters stating that his recommendation for the Victoria Cross had been approved and that the award would be formally presented in Wellington. Hume read the message twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. The medal meant nothing compared to what he had lost. His brother was dead. The battalion was still fighting in North Africa without him. 33 German snipers lay dead on Crete, yet Crete itself had fallen, and thousands of Allied soldiers had been killed or captured. Hume wondered whether any of it had mattered, whether his work had changed anything, whether personal grief had simply been poured into a battlefield that swallowed everything without judgment. The only thing he knew for certain was that he had done what he had to do. And now the war would continue without him. On October 10, 1941, the London Gazette officially published the citation for Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume's Victoria Cross, describing the actions he carried out between May 20th and May 28th. On Crete, stating that he had led counterattacks at Malim, destroyed the machine gun position at Galotas, eliminated 5 snipers at Suda Bay, and killed the mortar crew at Stios, yet the citation made no mention of the German smock that allowed him to slip behind enemy lines, nor did it reveal the deception tactics that made those kills possible. The newspapers across New Zealand printed the story on their front pages, calling him a national hero, the farm labourer from Dunedin, who became a one-man counter-sniper unit that protected the retreating forces. The public embraced him instantly, but Hume hated the attention. On November 7th, he travelled to Wellington for the formal ceremony at Government House, where Governor-General Sir Cyril Newall pinned the Victoria Cross to his uniform in front of officers, dignitaries, and reporters. Cameras flashed while speeches praised his courage and sacrifice. Hume stood still, showing no reaction, while thinking only of his brother, who still lay in an unmarked grave somewhere on Crete. After the ceremony, a reporter asked how it felt to be a hero. Hume said it did not feel like anything. The man pressed further, asking when Hume decided to take the German uniform and rifle. Hume said he saw an opportunity and took it. The reporter asked if he had been afraid. Hume said everyone was afraid. When the questions grew repetitive, he simply walked away. On February 17, 1942, the army discharged him as medically unfit for active service. His shoulder remained stiff and weak, and he could not raise his arm high enough to fire a rifle properly. The war moved on without him, while his friends in the 23rd Battalion continued fighting in North Africa. He struggled with the feeling that he had been removed from the war, while others still carried the burden. In May 1942, the government recalled him for home defense duties, where he spent 15 months training recruits, teaching basic infantry skills, and performing administrative work. He reached the rank of Warrant Officer Class II before being discharged again in September 1943. After the war, he moved to Pongakowa near Teapuke in the Bay of Plenty, where he bought a small trucking company and worked as a general carrier hauling freight across rural districts. The work paid enough to live, but did not demand more than one working arm, and that suited him. He married Rona Marjorie Murcott, and they raised 2 sons. Hume never spoke to his children about the war. He never explained the sniper hunts or the 18-hour fight for survival on Crete, or the reason he won the highest military honor in the Commonwealth. When people tried to ask, he would change the subject. When veteran groups invited him to speak, he declined without hesitation. In 1946, the British government invited all Commonwealth Victoria Cross recipients to London for the victory celebrations marking the end of the war. Hume attended and stood among decorated soldiers from across the empire. He met other VC winners, participated in parades, and sat through formal dinners. The king shook his hand. Churchill delivered an address. Hume smiled for the photographs because he felt expected to, but inside he wanted only to return home and resume his quiet work. Through the 1940s and 1950s, military historians began interviewing surviving members of the 23rd Battalion, and the scattered puzzle pieces of Hume's actions started to emerge. Soldiers recalled seeing him in a German smock. Others described bodies of German snipers found in strange places with no explanation. One sergeant remembered Hume disappearing for days, then returning with ammunition he had never been issued. These accounts formed the foundation of the legend, though Hume never confirmed or denied any of it. In 1953, a researcher asked him directly how he felt about killing 33 men. Hume replied that he felt nothing. The researcher asked if he ever thought about those Germans. Hume said he thought about his brother. When asked if he regretted anything, Hume said the only regret was that the 34th sniper got away. Years later, in 1967, his son Dennis Hume became the Formula One World Drivers' Champion, bringing sudden media interest to the family. Reporters flocked to Pongakowa, expecting to find a proud father eager to speak about racing and war stories. Instead, they found a 60-year-old trucking company manager who kept his Victoria Cross in a drawer and had no interest in speaking about either the battlefield or the racetrack. He continued to run his trucking business until retirement, maintaining only minimal contact with military groups. He attended Anzac Day ceremonies each year, but refused to give speeches or be honored publicly. When the Queen Elizabeth II Army Memorial Museum in Wairau asked to display his Victoria Cross, he agreed on the condition that they not turn it into a spectacle. On September 2, 1982, Alfred Clive Hume died in Teapuke at age 71. His death came quietly without warning. He was buried at Dudley Cemetery with full military honors. Veterans from the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force served as pallbearers. The service was brief, with no long speeches and no grand declarations of heroism, exactly as Hume would have wanted it. His Victoria Cross remained on display at the museum until December 2, 2007, when thieves broke in and stole it along with 8 other Victoria Crosses. Public outrage spread across New Zealand and Britain. Lord Michael Ashcroft and businessman Tom Sturgis offered a reward of $300,000. On February 16, 2008, police recovered all 9 medals unharmed. With that, the final chapter of Hume's wartime legacy remained intact, yet the deeper questions still lingered about what Hume had truly achieved on Crete during those 8 days of relentless killing, armed with a stolen rifle, wearing a dead man's uniform, and carrying the weight of both duty and grief. The official Victoria Cross citation for Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume recorded his actions on Crete in 163 words, noting that he had led attacks at Malim, cleared enemy holdouts at Galotas, destroyed a mortar crew at Stylos, and hunted down 33 enemy snipers before being severely wounded. Yet the citation said nothing of the German smock he wore or the deception that made his success possible, because military authorities did not want to draw attention to tactics that crossed the lines of international law. The New Zealand press celebrated him as a national hero, describing him as a farm labourer who had become a one-man counter-sniper force operating behind German lines. The public embraced the story of courage, but Hume himself disliked every moment of the praise. When he stood before officials at Government House receiving the medal, he felt none of the pride they expected, only the weight of memory and the silence of unanswered questions about his brother, who had died on the same island. Photographers lined up to capture the moment, and reporters surrounded him afterward, eager for heroic quotes, but Hume offered none. He answered only when pressed, and even then his replies were short. When asked whether he had felt fear, he said that every man felt fear. When asked how he had decided to use the German equipment, he said he had seen a chance and taken it. When the questions grew repetitive, he walked away. In February 1942, the army discharged him permanently after declaring his shoulder too damaged for further duty. He accepted the verdict without protest, knowing he would never again lift a rifle with his left arm. The 23rd Battalion fought on across the deserts of North Africa, while he remained in New Zealand, feeling separated from the war that had consumed everyone he knew. Yet in May 1942, the government recalled him for non-combat service, assigning him to home defense duties. He spent 15 months training young recruits, teaching them marksmanship, fieldcraft, and discipline, until his second discharge in September 1943. He left the service as a warrant officer Class II and stepped quietly back into civilian life. Afterward, Hume moved to Pongakawa in the Bay of Plenty and bought a small trucking business. He hauled freight across rural New Zealand and built a life that required no physical strain on his damaged shoulder. He married Rona Marjorie Murcott, and together they raised 2 sons. Hume never told his children about the war. He never described what happened in the olive fields above Maylim or on the ridges overlooking Suda Bay. He never spoke of the 33 men he killed or the day he almost died on the hillside near Stylos. When people asked, he simply changed the subject. When veterans groups invited him to speak, he refused. In 1946, Britain hosted victory celebrations in London and invited all Commonwealth Victoria Cross recipients. Hume attended because he felt he should, but he spent the event wishing he were back home. He met other decorated soldiers and marched in parades. He sat beside royalty and heard Churchill speak. He posed for photographs and shook hands, but none of it eased the ache that had lived inside him since Crete. Through the following decades, historians dug into the Battle of Crete and interviewed surviving soldiers from the 23rd Battalion. Pieces of Hume's story began to surface. Men recalled seeing him in a German smock during the withdrawal. Others described finding dead German snipers in locations that made little sense with no witnesses to explain who had killed them. One soldier remembered Hume quietly distributing captured ammunition that he never should have possessed. As these fragments spread, the legend of Hume grew, though he himself never confirmed or denied any part of it. In 1953, a researcher finally asked him how he felt about killing 33 men. Hume replied that he felt nothing. The researcher asked whether he thought about the Germans he had killed. Hume said he thought about his brother. When asked if he regretted anything, he said he regretted only that the 34th sniper escaped. In 1967, Hume's son Denys won the Formula One World Drivers' Championship, causing journalists from around the world to rush to Pongakawa, hoping to interview the father of the new racing hero and the man who had earned the Victoria Cross. They found a 60-year-old trucking company owner who kept his medal in a drawer and had no desire to discuss racing or war. Hume retired gradually and maintained only minimal ties to military organizations. He attended Anzac Day ceremonies but never gave speeches. When the Queen Elizabeth, the Second Army Memorial Museum in Wairau, asked if they could display his Victoria Cross, he agreed only if they promised not to make a spectacle of it. On September 2, 1982, Hume died suddenly at age 71 and was buried at Dudley Cemetery with full military honors. Veterans from the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force carried his casket. The service was simple and quiet, exactly as he wished. His Victoria Cross remained in the museum until December 2, 2007, when thieves broke in and stole 9 Victoria Crosses, including Hume's. The theft outraged the nation. British philanthropist Lord Michael Ashcroft and New Zealand businessman Tom Sturgis offered a reward of $300,000. On February 16, 2008, police recovered all 9 medals unharmed, restoring the final piece of Hume's legacy. Yet the true weight of his story still rested not in medals or public praise, but in the question of what he had accomplished during those 8 days on Crete, and what it had cost him to carry those memories through the rest of his life. After the medals were recovered and Hume's story once again circulated through newspapers and military archives, a deeper question lingered among historians and veterans alike. What had Hume truly achieved on Crete? 33 dead snipers seemed like a small number when compared to the thousands of Allied and German casualties that marked the 11-day battle from May 20th to May 31st, 1941. The island still fell, 12,000 Allied troops were captured, 3,500 were killed, the survivors evacuated under constant fire. German losses were brutal as well, with 4,000 dead and 2,500 wounded. The German airborne divisions were so devastated that Hitler forbade any large-scale airborne assault for the rest of the war. Yet Germany still held Crete, the Allies did not. In the context of such vast destruction, Hume's individual achievements appeared insignificant on the surface, no more than a single man slowing the German advance for a few hours. But the numbers told a very different story. During the 8-day period in which Hume operated German snipers, positioned around Maleme and along the withdrawal routes to Suda Bay, killed an estimated 200 Allied soldiers. Many more deaths listed as general combat casualties were in reality sniper kills targeting officers, medics, and radio operators with ruthless precision. In the sector where Hume moved in disguise, German sniper effectiveness dropped by 90% after May 23rd. The reports of the 23rd Battalion confirmed the shift. Between May 20th and May 22nd, they lost 47 men to sniper fire. Between May 23rd and May 30th, they lost 6. The difference was Hume. His relentless pursuit of enemy snipers removed the most lethal threat facing the withdrawing forces. His kill rate averaged more than 4 enemy snipers per day, placing him among the most effective counter-snipers of the entire Second World War, even when compared to long-serving legends like Vasily Zaitsev with 242 kills and Simo Häyhä with more than 500. Those men operated over years. Hume accomplished his 33 kills in 8 days behind enemy lines while wearing a uniform that legally stripped him of all protection if captured. That uniform, the German camouflage smock, was the key to everything. Standard counter-sniper doctrine in 1941 relied on slow observation, triangulation, and suppressive fire, often requiring hours to isolate a single sniper. Skilled marksmen who changed positions frequently could dodge Allied fire indefinitely. Hume bypassed every traditional method by walking directly toward enemy snipers who assumed he was one of them until the instant his rifle fired. It was an idea so bold and so dangerous that no military commander would have dared to authorize it. Had he been captured while wearing that smock, the Germans would have executed him on sight, as a spy under the Geneva Convention. Hume understood the risk and chose it anyway because it was the only way to save his men, and because after his brother's death, the fear of consequences no longer mattered to him. Despite the stunning success of his deception, it was never adopted as a formal tactic by Allied forces. Military legal advisors immediately rejected any plan involving enemy uniforms. Even beyond legality, the tactic required skills that could not be taught. It required a particular silence, a calmness under pressure, and a willingness to walk straight at trained killers without hesitation. Several soldiers in the 23rd Battalion attempted similar methods later in the North African campaign. 2 were shot instantly when German troops detected something wrong in their behavior. A third was captured and executed. Afterward, the battalion prohibited the use of enemy uniforms entirely. Their conclusion was simple: Hume succeeded because of circumstances and instincts no one else possessed. He operated in the chaos of the airborne invasion at a time when German units were scattered and confused. He used their own uniform against them at a moment when their cohesion was shattered. Had any single condition been different, he likely would have died on the first day. For these reasons, historians classify Hume's feat as a unique and unrepeatable military action. Yet for the men of the 23rd Battalion who survived the withdrawal from Crete, his actions were not abstract lessons in military doctrine. They were the reason those men lived to return home. Each dead German sniper represented an unseen number of Allied soldiers who were not shot while crossing a valley or retreating along a ridge or rushing across an exposed road. If one sniper could kill 10 men or 20 or even 50 over several days, then the removal of 33 snipers may have saved hundreds, possibly more than 1,000 lives. The exact number will never be known, but the impact was undeniable. German after-action reports written during and after the battle noted the disappearance of sniper teams without explanation. Some bodies were found with no signs of how they had been killed beyond a single close-range wound. Others were never found at all. One intelligence report speculated that the Allies had deployed special counter-sniper units armed with silencers. Another suggested that local civilians had formed militias. None guessed the truth. A single New Zealand sergeant wearing a stolen uniform had quietly dismantled an entire network of German marksmen. For years, the full truth remained buried because British and New Zealand officials did not want to publicize details that violated the laws of war, even if those violations had saved lives. Hume's citation mentioned the number of snipers he killed, but never revealed how. Only when veterans began speaking to historians decades later did the picture emerge. When asked, Hume always gave the same answer. He saw German gear that could help him kill German snipers, so he used it. Nothing more. But the simplicity of his answer hid the deeper truth about the kind of man who could walk calmly toward armed enemy soldiers for 8 days, knowing every step might end in instant death. Most soldiers would hesitate. Hume did not. His grief for his brother and his fierce sense of duty hardened into a focus so absolute that he never faltered. And because he never faltered, the 23rd Battalion survived its retreat. And because they survived, they carried his story with them long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the story of Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume stood as one of the most extraordinary yet least understood acts of individual combat in the Second World War. A brief 8-day span in which one New Zealand soldier changed the course of a retreat by doing something no doctrine allowed and no commander would have ordered. His Victoria Cross citation contained 163 official words outlining his attacks at Maleme, his part in the fighting at Galatas, his destruction of the mortar crew at Stylos, and his 33 confirmed sniper kills, yet the citation left out the single detail that made every one of those feats possible: the German camouflage smock he wore while moving behind enemy lines. Official histories recorded the kills, but not the method. Those who served beside him remembered the truth long before any archives did. They remembered the sudden drop in sniper fire after May 23rd. They remembered walking through valleys that should have been death traps and finding them strangely quiet. They remembered discovering German sniper bodies lying in positions no direct fire could have reached, with no explanation for who had killed them. For decades, the story remained partly hidden, partly whispered, until enough veterans had spoken, and enough records were released for historians to understand the full scale of what Hume had accomplished. 33 confirmed sniper kills in 8 days did not simply mark a high number. Each dead sniper represented someone on the New Zealand side who was not shot, someone who lived to return home, someone who survived the deadly withdrawal routes that twisted across the ridges of Western Crete. German snipers had clear instructions to target officers, medics, radio operators, machine gun crews, and anyone whose death would collapse the chain of command. A single skilled sniper could cripple an entire unit. Hume removed 33 of them. How many lives that saved will never be known. 10 per sniper, perhaps 20, perhaps 50. the numbers spiraled into figures no historian could calculate. What was clear was that the 23rd Battalion and the units withdrawing near it survived because a single man walked into the hills wearing an enemy's uniform and eliminated the shooters waiting for them. German commanders never understood what had happened. Their after-action reports mentioned unexplained losses among Volksjäger sniper teams' bodies, found with no sign of artillery fire, and positions overrun despite no known Allied patrol activity. One intelligence assessment suggested that the British must have used silenced rifles. Another guessed that armed civilians might have ambushed isolated snipers. None imagined that the same soldier they had seen walking calmly across open fields was the man killing their marksmen at close range. After the war, British and New Zealand authorities refused to highlight the disguise that made Hume's work possible because wearing enemy uniforms in combat violated international law. Prisoners captured while disguised in enemy uniform were considered spies and could be executed immediately. If captured, Hume would have died without trial. That danger followed him every time he stepped forward in the German smock. Military legal advisors pressed for silence on the matter, and as a result, the public knew only half the story. Only when veterans shared their memories and declassified files appeared did the full truth unfold into the legend known today. When questioned about it, Hume refused every attempt to turn his actions into mythology. He insisted that he saw German equipment that could help him kill German snipers, so he used it. Nothing more. Yet the simplicity of his answer hid the deeper truth. Few men could walk toward enemy soldiers wearing their uniform without fear. Fewer still could do it 8 days in a row while climbing through hills filled with enemy patrols and machine gun posts. Hume possessed an inner stillness, a calm forged out of grief for his brother and the fierce will to protect the men retreating behind him. That grief transformed into something sharp and focused, and it never let him hesitate. When he approached those 5 German snipers on the hillside, waving back at them until he reached 40 yards, he was not thinking about military doctrine or victory medals. He was thinking about a 19-year-old corporal named Harold who had died on the same ground, and he continued forward because stepping back was something he no longer knew how to do. His tactic succeeded only because the moment was unrepeatable. The airborne invasion created chaos. The Volksjäger moved in dispersed, unpredictable groups. Communication collapsed, and friendly fire confusion made the uniform almost enough to guarantee safety. Once the German forces reorganized, such deception would not have worked. Later attempts in North Africa proved fatal for the soldiers who tried. They lacked the exact mix of timing, terrain, and temperament that allowed Hume to succeed. For this reason, historians classify his feat as singular, something that worked once in history and would never work again. But for the men of the 23rd Battalion, the tactical uniqueness of Hume's actions mattered less than the immediate fact that they survived because of him. They marched off Crete alive because the sniper who would have killed them was already lying still on a hillside behind them with a single rifle wound to the chest. And that was the legacy that mattered. Not the citation, not the medal, not the ceremonies he despised, but the simple truth that hundreds of men lived to return home, because one man decided he would not let the Germans take another soldier the way they had taken his brother. He never bragged, he never boasted, he never replayed the story. He carried it quietly for the rest of his life, as if the weight belonged to him alone. And because he refused to speak, the world only learned the full story years later, long after Crete fell, long after he retired, long after he died. In the end, Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume did not fight for glory or recognition. He fought for the men beside him and for the brother he lost. And though the island of Crete was lost, and the battle recorded as an Allied defeat, the lives he saved stood as a silent victory carved not in grand strategy, but in 33 single shots delivered by a man walking alone behind enemy lines, wearing a stolen uniform, and refusing to surrender a single inch to despair. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters. Subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.